Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son, Achilleus. This is the first line of the greatest book, arguably, ever written, the Iliad by Homer. This is the Latimore translation, which came into my possession only a week ago. I have read another translation multiple times, but interestingly enough, it seems like the Latimore translation is one that is preferred by academics when they teach classics in Canada, because apparently you have to get the Latimore translation because that's part of the syllabus, because there seem to be differences in translation, as there always are. And the Latimore translation seems to be the preferred one, which I didn't know, but now I have it in my possession in this beautiful edition. Let me see if there's a date in it. 1962. This book is 62 years old today. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the book that is my favorite book of all time. This is probably going to be a ramble, because you cannot simply talk about the Iliad by just talking about the text itself, the people in the book, the people in the text, I should say, because it isn't strictly speaking a book. The Iliad is an epic poem which was performed orally by rhapsodes, and even in Athenian classical times, the Iliad and the Odyssey were performed in Athens, for example. We know this. And the fact that we have it as a book is something that is more of a recent invention, because it wasn't written down until about the 8th century BC. And before that time, it was transmitted orally. And this has been proven. So if people are now saying, oh, well, there was one guy and he was Homer and he wrote this, this is not true. I do believe that there was a man named Homer who was a rhapsode, and probably one who is, it's past, who was considered to be an excellent rhapsode, and probably turned the oral tradition and the orally handed down versions of the Iliad into something that we would call an authorized version. So basically he was probably one of the most gifted rhapsodes, and somebody probably listened to him and decided to write down his rendition of the Iliad. So when we say Homer's Iliad, it's not like there was this guy Homer who was also supposedly blind. So the fact that he wrote it is highly unusual and would be highly unlikely, seeing as he was supposed to be blind. So Homer didn't sit down and write this book. If anything, somebody took dictation from him. But you cannot really talk about Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, which in my opinion is actually the inferior work of the two. I don't really like it. I've read it many times, but it's not as interesting as all that, without looking at Greek history, ancient Greek prehistory even, or very old ancient Greek history, the gods, and also what is called the Homeric cycle. And I'm going to do all of this. So this is going to be a very rambly vlog, and it's probably going to last a long time. So you might want to get yourself a hot chocolate like me, sit down, relax, maybe get some popcorn out. I won't be showing you anything. So if you want to listen to this like a podcast, please do. So unlike what most people think, the Iliad is not about the Trojan War. It is about a couple of days towards the very end of the Trojan War. Many things that people think of when they hear the Iliad are actually not even in the book. The Trojan horse isn't in there. Nor are any of the stories around Helen and Paris. They are all part of the Homeric cycle, so stories that were written and touched upon the story of the Trojan War, that were inspired by the Trojan War, story that basically are prequels, side quests, if you like, and then post quests. And of course, the Odyssey is also a post quest because it's what happens after the Trojan War, when Athena is really pissed off with the Greeks because Ajax decided to rape Cassandra in the temple of Athena while she was holding on to a statue of Athena, which of course is doubly sacrilegious, plus Cassandra is also a virgin, so, you know, triply badly so done by Ajax. So basically, Athena wasn't amused and she said, well, I'm going to curse you guys and you're not going to get home. And of course, Odysseus didn't. It took him 10 years to get home. So, what is the story about? Well, a long, long time ago, there was a man named Menelaus. He was the brother of Agamemnon. And Agamemnon and Menelaus were kings in ancient Greece. And when I say ancient Greece, I mean Bronze Age Greek culture, Bronze Age Greece. So we're talking about the 13th century BC. About 400 years before the Iliad was written down. They were brothers, and they fell in love with two sisters, Helen and Clytemnestra of Sparta. Now, Helen and Clytemnestra are only half-sisters because Helen's father is Zeus and Clytemnestra's father isn't, but they have the same mother, Leda and the swan, and they are the daughters of one of the kings of, or basically the only king of Sparta at the time. Later, in classical Greek times, Sparta has two kings. It's a really weird setup. Maybe we will touch upon it, but at that moment in time, there was one king. And he had two daughters, Clytemnestra and Helen. What we need to understand is that in ancient Greece, even in classical Greek culture, girls usually married at the age of 12 to 14, unless they were Spartan. And they married men that were considerably older, usually about twice their age. 28 was on the young side for a Greek man to marry. Usually they would be around 30. So the two brothers marry two children, if you like, child brides. There is no other way to describe it. And arguably, Helen was the most beautiful of all womankind in ancient Greece at that time. And now we have to do some kind of time travel and also suspense of disbelief because the gods enter into the picture. There is a feast to which gods and humans are invited. And into that feast enters a personality named Discord. And she's got an apple. It's a golden apple, and on it says to the fairest. And she throws it onto the table and asks Paris, son of Priam of Troy, to give it to the woman he considers fairest. And there are different women at the table. So there is Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite, two female goddesses. And they all think that they are the fairest. And basically, each of them is trying to persuade Paris to give the apple to her. And they all promise him different things. And Aphrodite says, give the apple to me and I will give you the most beautiful woman as your wife. And he's like, okay, that's cool. And he hands over the apple to Aphrodite. And Aphrodite makes it so that at some point, Paris will meet Helen and he will get married. The problem is, of course, when the story resumes, because there is kind of like a little bit of a time problem here, because Peleus is also involved, and and Thetis, and they're the mother and father of Achilles. So it doesn't really work that well, but it's kind of like it's a whole cycle of stories. So anyway, Paris is the brother of Hector, and son of Priam. Priam is the king of Troy. He has many wives. Basically, the Trojans are not really Greek. They do believe in the same gods, but they are different. Basically, they are of different descent. They probably speak Greek to a certain degree. It's not quite clear if they're native speakers, but they're definitely alien. They're definitely the other. And this becomes important when we look at why the Iliad became so important to Greek nationalism, as it were. So essentially, Priam establishes diplomatic relations with Greek city-states. So we've got Mycenae, we've got Sparta, and so on and so forth. So essentially, Agamemnon marries Clytemnestra. He's the king of Mycenae. She follows him to Mycenae, and they live not happily ever after, but they live there and they have children. Orestes, Antigone, and Iphigenia, and I think there's a fourth one whose name I now forget. And then we have Menelaus, who marries Helen. Now, the way the Spartan kingdom was managed was that if you married the princess, you had to, the crown princess, so the princess that was going to take the throne, you had to move there and you would become king of Sparta. So Menelaus moves to Sparta to live there with his wife Helen, who will later on become queen of Sparta, and therefore he becomes king of Sparta. And one day, Priam sends his son, Paris, young, dashing, good-looking, and possibly younger than Menelaus, to Sparta on a diplomatic mission. Now, remember, he's been promised to get married to the most beautiful woman on earth. So he meets Helen, and there we have two situations that may have happened. One is she falls madly in love with this dashing young man, and the two of them elope. The other one, which is equally well established in myth, is that she didn't really want him, but he said, "You are mine because Aphrodite promised me that you would be mine and you would marry me, so I'm going to steal you away." And he basically takes her away. The two of them travel back to Troy. There is a scene on an island where he may or may not have raped her. It may have been consensual. That again depends on which myth you are reading when you're reading about it. But be that as it may, he has terribly violated the most important of ancient Greek laws, and that is the law of guest-host relationship. And this guest-host relationship is under the protection of Zeus. So Zeus is pissed off. You go to another place as a guest. The host hosts you. They have to look after you. They have to make sure that nothing happens to you, that, you know, as long as you are under their roof, nobody is allowed to attack you. If somebody were to attack you or somebody were to harm you, your host would have to go out there and actually confront them and even wage war on your behalf. That's how strong this relationship is. And this guy goes there and he steals the king's wife. It's unheard of, and it's unbelievable, and it's a sacrilege because it violates a holy law which is presided over and watched over by Zeus himself. And so, and of course there is all of this shame, because of course Menelaus is like, well, you know, what does that mean now? You know, my wife has been stolen. So that's a big issue. So he's kind of crestfallen. What do I do? Mopes around a little bit, and then goes to his brother Agamemnon, who's the king of Mycenae. And he says, well, Agamemnon, we need to do something. And Agamemnon is like, yeah, straight to the point. ask all of the other kings and rulers of Greece, and please remember there is no such thing as ancient Greece. Not in Mycenaean times and not in classical times. Greece as a nation does not exist until Alexander. And even then Sparta didn't play ball. They were doing their own thing. So he's like, okay, well, we will just go to everybody and we will just ask them all to send troops, and I will be the head of this army. Agamemnon, I'm the best, I'm the greatest, and I'm the strongest, and I will run this whole gig, and you can come with me as well, bring some Spartans, and we'll get your wife back. And so they basically start out looking for people. They go to Ithaca, where Odysseus lives. Odysseus has no interest whatsoever in going anywhere, so he pretends to be crazy. And he pretends to be so crazy by, plowing with, like he does something. I think he puts the plow before the oxen and then expects the plow to work, and of course it doesn't. So he pretends to be cray, but soon is discovered and found out and kind of coerced to follow with his contingent. We have of course Achilleus, who is a half god as well. He's the son of Thetis. And he brings his myrmidons. Now, myrmidons are interesting because the name of these soldiers translates as ants. So there's kind of like a whole story about why they are ants and where this comes from. But he's got his myrmidons with him, and of course he also has his friend / lover Patroclus. And they follow as well. And you have at some point what is called the catalogue of ships in this rendition, where basically they say whoever is going to be there, and they list the ships and how many people from what place, and who's the ruler there and who's the leader, which a lot of scholars kind of go, why is this in there? Because it doesn't make sense. It breaks the narrative, but it's in there. It does remind me a little bit of the so-called Highland muster rolls, which you can find, where basically all of the Highland clans that have come together to form a war band are listed, and these are often sung. So basically Duncan's coming, Dougal's coming, Lachlan's coming, Ranald's coming. So there is even a musical rendition by, I don't know if it's Runrig, but there is a beautiful rendition of the Highland muster roll, which you can check out online. I'm pretty sure that you can stream it these days. Anyway, so all of these Greeks unite. They also refer to themselves as Achaeans, and they basically say, okay, let's sail. And they launch their ships. So here comes the famous face that launched 1,000 ships, namely our friend Helen, who may or may not, and this is very important, have gone willingly, and who may or may not have actually made it to Troy, because there is a school of myths, like where she's not even there, but instead it's a picture or a sculpture of her, and she's actually in Egypt. I know that this is crazy, but there are ancient Greek myths which state that she never went there. She went to Egypt. So basically, all of the host sets out in ships and sails across the Aegean to Troy, which is in today's Turkey, Hisarlik. And if you're now going to say, oh, Troy didn't exist, I know that there is a school of thought, especially in Germany, and they who say Troy doesn't exist. That's wrong. Unfortunately, they are quite stubborn. They keep repeating it, but just if you keep repeating alternative facts, that doesn't make them any truer. Troy did exist. Is Troy, the historical Trojan War Troy, the one that Schliemann found? No, he made a mistake. That's all been cleared up. We know which of the layers of Troy at Hisarlik is the Troy that would have matched with the descriptions that we find in the Iliad, and that also makes sense with historical facts that we can find out of in archives from the Hittite Empire. So we know where Troy was, and we know that it did exist. So anyway, they make their way across the sea. However, there's a problem. There's a lull, a huge lull. There is no wind, and they are stranded. They can't get any further, and they are in Aulis, which is an island in the Aegean. And basically, the question is what's now to be done. And the gods interfere or not. It again depends on what you read. And Agamemnon decides that he's going to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. He asks for her to be sent to Aulis, because of course this is a war host. There are no women, and his daughter of course isn't there. So he goes and tells Clytemnestra, his wife, well, he sends a message saying, send Iphigenia to me. And then he sacrifices her, which of course Clytemnestra, his wife, isn't really happy about, which is understandable, which leads to a lot of issues that happen later, which we will touch upon later. There is also again, a side story which says that he didn't really kill her, but at the very last moment, Artemis came and switched out Iphigenia for a hind, which he then kills and sacrifices. And she spirits Iphigenia away to Tauris, which is another island where she then lived. And there's also a whole story about Iphigenia in Tauris. So be that as it may, the winds pick up and they manage to sail to Troy. They arrive in Troy, or on the coast, and they set up camp there. And I mean, we're talking about hundreds of people, possibly thousands. I mean, depending on who you believe. I honestly do not believe that the war host would have been this big. But of course, big or small, they need a lot of stuff. They need provisions, they need food, they need water, they need drink. And what do? Well, they don't just go there, build a trench and besiege Troy and just wait and basically run against the walls of Troy, try to bring it down, bring out battering rams or whatever. They don't. They also, on their way, plunder, pillage, rape, steal, burn. They are like the crazy forces during the 30 Years' War. They set fire to that part of the Aegean. Whoever wasn't Greek, they just destroyed them. And this is also where the story actually begins, because I said, sing muse of the wrath of Achilles. Why is Achilles raging? What's happened? Well, Achilles is the hero, the best warrior on the Greek side. And mind you, there are many, many great warriors on both sides. There are half-gods there, sons of Zeus. Sarpedon, for example, is a son of Zeus. He later on will fall before the walls of Troy. So you have Odysseus, you have the two Ajax. You have so many heroes that are there in front of Troy, besieging, fighting this war. But Achilles is the best one of them on the Greek side. On, of course, at the Trojan side, the best one is Hector, brother of Paris. And you have Agamemnon, who says, I'm the leader of this pack. I'm the best guy ever because I'm the king. He's not king of kings, but he believes he is. And they at some point plunder a village or a town, and they take the daughter of the local priest of Apollo, Briseis, and they give her, Chryseis. They have very similar names, Chryseis, and they give her as a prize of war to Achilles. So Achilles is kind of like, okay, so yeah, now I've got this girl, great. But her father, Chryses, comes and beseeches Agamemnon and the Greek host to let her go. And he says, well, she's my only daughter and she's my daughter and please let her go. Please don't spoil her. Don't touch her. Let her go. But Agamemnon is like, no, we're not going to do this. She's our, we won, you lost. We take what's ours. And Chryses starts praying to Apollo. And he says, you know what, God Apollo, if I've ever worshipped you in such a way that satisfied your heart and soul and was, to your satisfaction, please help me now. And Apollo kind of goes, yep, I will. And he descends upon the Greek army's camp and shoots his arrows. And he's, of course, the god of wisdom and, not the god of wisdom, but the god of divination, but also the god of plague. And he shoots his arrows, and each person that gets hit gets infected by the plague. And the plague ravages the Greek war host. And so they basically have an assembly and say, okay, so what should we do? What's going on? And the Greek seer of the host realizes what's happening and says, well, it's because we have angered Chryses, who in turn has turned to Apollo, who is now taking revenge. So return Chryses to Chryses and everything will be fine. So Agamemnon goes, okay, easily done. Achilles, this girl that I sent you, whatever you're doing with her, stop doing that immediately and send her back, because otherwise everybody will die. And Achilles is like, what do you actually think? Who do you think you are? You know what? You think that you can go in there and tell me what I'm supposed to do with my prize, who has been awarded to me by all my fellow warriors. I am the best one. I am the one who leads all the attacks. I'm the mastermind behind all of this. I plan and strategize, and then I go in. There are no wounds on my back. All the wounds that I have are at my front. What does that mean? Well, it means that he's always at the forefront and he never runs. But you, Agamemnon, you are just basically sitting there and you're just taking everything that you own today and everything that you've been taking during all of these battles because you are the king. And that's a very interesting take on things because, of course, we're looking at an aristocratic setup here. And we know that Bronze Age Greece was set up with an aristocratic layer, and then you had the masses below this. And the aristocracy is in power because of who they are, because of the fact that they inherited their power. However, classical Greek culture is very different. There are no, except for Sparta, in classical Greek society, there are no kings, there are no tyrants, there are elected representatives. Demos, the people, elect a group of people who will then rule the city-states. And it was supposed to be a meritocracy. So you are a good person, you are successful, you're intelligent, you make the most of your life according to Greek customs and what the Greeks consider meritful, and therefore you are a good person that should be elected and should be running affairs of state. And this is one of the first clues that the Iliad as we have it today, in its rendition attributed to Homer, is describing something that happened in Bronze Age ancient Greece, but is just a backdrop for modern ideas which show that this idea of aristocracy is no longer all the rage. It's now a meritocracy where you have to prove your worth. And just because you are the son or daughter or king or whatever of someone doesn't mean that you have any right whatsoever. You have to prove that you are worthy. And that's one of the first inklings that you get at the very beginning in this long discussion, that all isn't as it seems in the Iliad. And that's where I would like to take a little break and talk about when the Iliad was finally written down. Now, when we look at the Greek alphabet today, it looks different from the alphabet that we use for English, which is the Latin one, but it looks quite similar. Why is that? That's because both are derived from one another, the Latin from the Greek and the Greek from the Phoenician alphabet. And then there is another script, which we have discovered, two versions of it, called Linear A and Linear B. You may have heard about this because these two were found in Crete, in Knossos, by Evans, and he found so much written down in those two alphabets. So soon people discovered that they are two separate writing systems, they are different, and they were unreadable until, I want to say, the 1950s. People analyzed the script and try to make inferences on the language setup that was represented through this script, what this language was like, what it looked like. So they kind of said, okay, we believe it's a highly inflectional language, like Latin, like ancient Greece, because we can see that the roots are the same, and then there's a different symbol that follows. Let's say you have a little word that looks like a piece of bread, a loaf of bread. And then next to it you have different ideograms which change depending on where this loaf symbol appears. Then you can say, okay, the loaf is probably a word that represents something, but this word changes depending on the position in the sentence, for example, like you have in Greece, in Greek and in Latin. So they knew about the structure of the language before they could translate it, which is very interesting. And it wasn't until the 1950s that one, namely Linear B, was deciphered. A young Englishman who unfortunately died very young and very shortly after he had deciphered it, found out that Linear B is the writing system of a very, very, very archaic and ancient form of Greek. Bronze Age Greek. And they found the same writing style, the same script, and the same language in Mycenae. So chances are that the Mycenaeans went to Knossos, where we know people lived who spoke a non-Greek language, and probably took over, or there was a strong influence there. So back then, the Bronze Age Greeks wrote using Linear B. And then something happened in the 12th century BC, which precipitated the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages, there are different theories as to what happened. For some time, people thought it was also to do with the explosion of Thera, today's Santorini, which was a huge volcanic island which erupted and caused tsunamis and a darkening of the atmosphere because it was huge. It was a lot worse than Vesuvius explosion in 70 AD. And we don't really know. I mean, there are some ideas of what would have happened, what could have happened, what did happen, but we honestly don't know, because something incredible happened as a result of this earth-shattering event, whatever that was. The Greeks lost the ability to write. And I think for a culture like ours that has an unbroken line of literacy, history of literacy reaching back for centuries. I mean, we have written versions of Old English, so that's 8th century AD. So that's 1,300 years of unbroken writing. The Greeks didn't have that, because round about 1150 or so, the Dark Ages set in and all writing was completely swept away. Not only writing, but the whole Mycenaean Bronze Age culture collapsed. And not only in Greece, but everywhere. We have the Sea Peoples who started to try and invade Egypt. It was a total catastrophe. And they didn't start writing again until the 8th century. And when they did, they had completely forgotten about their own alphabet. They took the Phoenician one. So they had completely ignored, and basically this is a clear indication for scholars to say that there was a complete break. Because if there had still been people writing, even if nothing might have come down to us, they wouldn't have just taken on a completely different writing system. And Linear B is completely different from the alphabet that the ancient Greeks used to write down ancient Greece, ancient classical Greek. I once even read in a book that somebody said, oh, and actually the reason why they reinvented writing was because they wanted to take down the Iliad from Homer. I wouldn't go so far, but it is true that Homer's Iliad is one of the first written extant works in ancient Greek, in the new script, in the Greek alphabet that we have. That is true. So what you have to see is you have a people who have lost everything. Their culture, not their spoken language, but their written language. And they are trying to pick up the pieces. And there you also see that you are dealing with a people where all of the government and all of the political structures have broken down. They do remember the old days, the golden age. And we find this in Homer as well. And we also have to imagine that the story around the Trojan War was told over and over and over again in verse form, because that's the easiest to remember such a long poem, such a long story, if it's in verse form and if you sing it, because the rhapsodes would have sung. And it kind of harkens back to the old days, the good old days. But you also see that certain elements of what life was like were remembered, and some of them were misremembered, and some of them were totally misunderstood. So they did remember, let's say, the image, but they didn't understand the reason and what was behind it. So we find this on the one hand in the description of Achilleus actually confronting Agamemnon and saying, hey, this is a meritocracy, which Mycenaean Greek culture wasn't at all. So here we see this clash of cultures already. So we have a culture that is now trying to pick up the pieces again and is now trying to reinvent itself, where they're like, the old aristocracy couldn't help us. They're probably all dead. So now we have to rebuild ourselves, and we're going to go for the people who are most able. Another example of this clash between the old and the new is the fact that Ajax has a huge shield. It's a towering shield made of oxhide, which he carries around, which basically hides his whole body. This is something that we only find in Bronze Age Greece. We don't find this in later periods. So they knew what the warriors looked like, the kind of a gear that they had, but he's the only one. Nobody else has such a shield. And another thing, which one of the scholars that looked at it as a description of war and fighting, from a military perspective, said it's funny to read about the chariots that they have, because we know what chariot warfare is like, because we see it in Assyria, we see it in Egypt, where you have like people riding or sitting on the chariots and basically plowing into the other army and basically, like causing mayhem and destruction. Whereas here, it's kind of different. The heroes all have a driver and a chariot and horses, and then the driver drives them to basically a place where they then meet an opponent, and they also are driven in, and then the two of them have a duel, basically on foot. So it's more like, this guy was saying, well, it's more like using a taxi to get to a gunfight, and I think this is very apt, because this is not chariot warfare. The reason for this was that, and he surmises that the reason was that they knew that there were chariots used in Mycenaean times, like, they would be used by the Assyrian army and by the Egyptian army, but they had no concept of how this kind of fighting worked. So they just thought, okay, we know what horses are, we know what chariots are, so what would you do? Well, you use it as a method of transport, which isn't chariot warfare. But this is basically how the chariot survived into Homeric times, because people were trying to understand what was going on, and they had a completely different image. They didn't understand the reason for people having chariots when they were fighting, so they just made one up. So you have the image, but the meaning of the image is completely different. And so essentially, this is the situation at the beginning of the Iliad. And they take Chryseis, so basically Agamemnon wins, and Chryseis is taken and brought back to her father. And Achilles begins to mope. He turns into a stroppy teenager and says, well, you know what, sod you. You take away my prize, I will make you beg for me to come back. I will not raise a finger. I will not help you. My myrmidons are not going to help in the war effort. See how far you get. And that's where Achilles' wrath happens. He is now stroppy. He goes to the waterside and he talks to Thetis, his mother, who is one of the Nereides. So basically she lives with her father Nereus, who is one of the oldest gods. He's not part of the pantheon, but he's older than most of them, at the very bottom of the sea. She's also a very tragic figure, because she was raped by her later husband Peleus, who is the father of Achilles, and basically was impregnated and then forced to marry him. So she married him, she bore his son, and then as soon as the son was there, she just basically handed him over to his dad and went back into the ocean. But of course, Achilles knows who he is, he knows who his mother is, so he basically cries out to her and says, Mother, I've been wronged, and she ascends from the depths, and she basically takes him in her lap, and she says, well, there, and tell me all about it. And she learns what's happened. She says, okay. And he says, well, make them bleed, make them suffer. I'm so cross with them. And she says, okay, sure, son, I'll do this. So she goes up to Zeus and says, Zeus, if you've ever loved me, the two of them actually didn't have a relationship. So Thetis is probably one of the very few goddesses that Zeus hasn't slept with. She's also considerably older than him. And she says, well, Zeusy, I have a problem. My son has been wrong, blah, blah, blah. And I'm really pissed off at this. Do something. And he nods. And apparently when Zeus nods, first of all, the earth shakes, not quite, but, it's very important. It's like this affirmative action. It's this performative speech act. Yes. And he's going to do something. And he's going to say, okay, I'm going to make the Greeks suffer. Gonna make them suffer. I'm gonna award the next couple of wins to Troy. Troy's going to, destroy parts of the Greek army until such time as they then come back groveling to your son to help them out. And so it happens. But of course, we've got the gods. And there are gods that are quite in favor of Troy. For example, of course, Aphrodite, because her beloved Paris, the one who said, "You're the fairest of them all," is Trojan. So she's like pissed off at this. Then her brother Ares, he's in favor of the Greeks. He's kind of pissed off. So basically then there's this whole quarrel between the gods and they all take sides and, the ebb and flow. But basically Zeus is like, well, I've made up my mind. It's going to be the Greeks for a while who are going to suffer. Don't care what you're saying. And he has a falling out with Hera, and then there's a lot of stuff where Hera then seduces him on Mount Olympus so that he doesn't, and then he falls asleep because, he's exhausted after sex, and then basically they do a lot of shenanigans while he's not looking because he's asleep and stuff. It's quite funny actually in some places, but after a while it gets so terrible that Agamemnon is told by his advisors, we need to get Achilles back on the battlefield because we're being crushed left, right, and center. He's like, blah, 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 blah. And they send a group of people to talk to him. And he's like, I don't care. Sod you. Don't care. Not interested. And then they finally persuade Agamemnon to give up his prized war bride, Briseis, and yes, they all have very similar names, and say, okay, give him this girl, and that may make up for his losing Chryseis. And so he takes Briseis and says, okay, well, let's do this. Briseis is handed over, and Agamemnon assures, well, he's never there. He doesn't speak to Achilles himself. And he says, well, tell him that I never touched her. So this means she's still a virgin. So, you're not going to get sloppy seconds here. This is, completely untouched, unspoiled wares. And finally, oh, so finally, Achilles relents. And he goes back onto the battlefield. And the tide turns in favor of the Greeks. And so there's fighting back and forth. The gods get involved. But we also see quite a lot of interesting things about the Greek, the classical Greek worldview. And also about the power of the gods. Because we believe, Zeus killed his parents, they in turn killed the Titans, so there's always this long line of different types of godly creatures that kill each other and kill their forebears, to take power. And by all accounts, the gods are omniscient and the gods are omnipotent. But we know that when they are sleeping, when they're asleep, they don't know what's going on. And they have to find out later. So it's not like it's always present. They do have to learn about things before they know them. But it's a lot easier for them to know about these things. And since they are very tall, they can also walk very quickly from A to B. It's just one step. And we believe that they're omnipotent, that they can do whatever they like. However, there is a group of people who also are godly. We are not quite sure who they are. That basically hold much more power than all of them. They never use their power, but they are much more powerful. And that's the Moirai. Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. These three, the mother, the maiden, and the crone, basically decide everyone's fate to a degree. It's not quite clear if they actually decided or if they just measure it out, but they spin the wool, make a thread, and then they cut it. And when they cut your thread, you die. And one of the guys who dies is, and so many people die in this war, is Sarpedon, son of Zeus. And Zeus is broken. And he says, oh, and and I'm going to revive him. And everybody's like, no, you can't. And he's like, of course, watch me. And they're like, well, no, you can't. You're able to, but you can't, because it's the law. If the fates decide that a mortal has to die, then they die. And we cannot overthrow this. We cannot overturn their verdict. If they say somebody dies, then they die. That's it. End of story. And so Zeus, and this is where we learn that Zeus may be omnipotent, but there are certain laws that transcend his omnipotence, that transcend his being the king of gods. He cannot overturn the verdict of the Moirai. Interestingly enough, the Moirai are kind of weird because they are really in the background, but they seem to be the most powerful because they decide who lives and dies, and no one, not even the almighty gods, can do anything about that. And so Sarpedon is then spirited away. He dies, he's dead, and then he's spirited away to his homeland and to his parents. I don't know if his mum is still alive, but I think his dad is. Anyway, so we learn this about the gods and their power and powerlessness in the face of fate. And then something happens. And I'm actually not sure. Yeah, the reason why Achilleus actually relents is because something terrible happens. The Greeks are really battered. And his best friend and lover, Patroclus, says, I'm going to fight. Give me your armor, I'm going to fight. And he dies. And Achilleus is so heartbroken, and again, he's raging, because that's all he does. And he basically then takes revenge. And that's the famous scene between Hector and Achilleus. Hector being the champion on the side of Troy. The two of them fight it out, and Hector loses and dies. And Achilleus is so vengeful and so enraged that he takes Hector's body, ties it to his chariot, and runs it around Troy several times in order to defile the body, because obviously the most important thing is to bury the body. So he's not doing this. He's also destroying the body, and he is also then taking the body with him. So he's depriving Priam, king of Troy, father of our friend Hector, of the ability and the possibility of burying his son, which is again a violation of so many sacred laws. Because he's so heartbroken. His lover has died and he's just full of grief. He cannot actually contain this grief. So he's taking it all out on the dead body of Hector. And here again the gods interfere, because they ensure that the body does not decay. They keep the body fresh, they keep it in good condition, like he's sleeping. And then a very interesting scene comes. And it is this scene that always breaks my heart. Because what we have to bear in mind is the war between these two nations is fought with such bitterness and with such vengefulness and with such bloodiness, They're not giving each other an inch. There is no discussion about, oh, give us Helen and we will walk away from this. No. It's either the Greeks get destroyed or Troy gets destroyed, plus the Trojans. And Priam then, again with divine help, smuggles himself into Achilleus's tent behind the Greek lines. And the two of them have a conversation which I believe is probably one of the most beautiful parts ever, or beautiful pieces of literature ever written. And they reconcile for a short while. And Achilleus says to Priam, take your son. I will give you time to remove the body, take it home. But don't take too long, because I will change my mind and then I'll kill you. And so Achilleus lets Priam go after a very long discussion about life, about death, and about decency, and about how our customs, how the laws that we have agreed upon, not necessarily given to us by the gods, but quite often in those days, make it possible for us to live together, and how violating those laws will destroy everything. It will destroy the foundations of society. And we see this today, where essentially anything goes in politics. I mean, you can say things today that you wouldn't have been able to say 20 years ago, or even 30, or even 15 years ago. I mean, so many things have happened in most recent history that you kind of go, okay, well, you know, this consensus of what is appropriate, of what is proper, has been lost. And here it's reestablished, and it's made clear that keeping the body, defiling the body, is a no-go. And the defiling has been halted, and he's been restored because of godly intervention. And Achilleus, and this is important, not because of divine coercion or intervention, understands the pain that Priam is in, because he is in just as much pain over Patroclus. He understands, and for this one moment, these two enemies, these terribly bloody enemies, see eye to eye, and they realize this is a human being sitting across from me, being just as grief-stricken, but caught up in this war that we cannot escape, because this war can only end in the utter destruction of the enemy. Whoever wins will utterly destroy the others. That's what's going to happen, and they know this. They just don't know who's going to win. And for this one time, it's enemy and enemy, seeing that they're all just human and they all have the same feelings. They are just the same. And I think this is the most powerful piece of literature ever written. And if you've read the Iliad, you don't need to read anything else, because it's all in here. But there are other aspects in the Iliad that are quite worth mentioning, because, and here it ties in with the Odyssey as well. I spoke about the idea of meritocracy, and the most important thing about a Greek warrior, or anyone in Greece, was to be remembered after your death. People talk about you, which means you will never truly die. And this is your fame that lives and represents you ever after. Dying in obscurity, not being talked about, being forgotten, that's like the true death. But physical death, as long as you're remembered, as long as people sing songs about you, as long as you are remembered and spoken about, means you're not truly dead. And I mean, this is something that was a form of, or a belief and understanding in ancient Greek times. So we can safely say that 2,800 years later, we still speak about Achilleus. He's definitely achieved this. He's achieved immortality, because we still talk about him. However, in the Odyssey, Odysseus goes into the underworld where he sees, because it's not a secret, Achilles finally dies. He dies before the gates of Troy. He doesn't survive the war. And in the Odyssey, Odysseus goes into the underworld and meets the shade of Achilles. So his spirit or whatever, their shades in the underworld. And Achilles says, I would have thought that dying, a great death that everyone remembers and talks about, is the best thing ever. But now that I'm a shade, now that I'm dead, I will tell you this, Odysseus. I should have chosen a long life in obscurity, had children, worked in the field, ploughed my field, and I would have preferred an obscure life and an obscure death, but a long life with my family. And that is an interesting take on things because it upends everything that ancient Greeks believed in. This whole idea of fame after death, he completely denounces it. He says, well, that's a mistake. It's wrong. It doesn't help you. You're dead. Live a long life in obscurity and forget about fame. And that's an interesting take because a lot of people say that Homer wrote the Odyssey as his, like towards the end of his life. Again, we're talking about, did Homer actually write them? And I really don't think he did. I think he recited them. He was probably the one definitive version of the Odyssey and the Iliad that he kept telling and people really took to and then decided to write down. But you see this shift again. Where you can also see, okay, we're moving again away from a very important part of Greek society. In the beginning, you have the aristocracy, which is then replaced by the meritocracy, and which is then replaced by the idea of the individual who lives long is the happier. Because life after death, even if you are remembered, is nothing. So at some point the Greeks win. We all know this. But they win, and this is not in the book either. They win by a trick. The Trojan horse is built at the behest of Odysseus. The Greek soldiers hide in it. The Greek army leaves, gets on their ships, sails away. The Trojans are like, hey, yay, we won. And look, they gave us a horse. And there are plenty of reasons why it was a horse. There are different debates about it. Some of them I find really funny. Some of them I find interesting. Number one, the Trojans and the area where the whole thing was situated, the Troas, was horse rearing country. The Trojans were people who raised horses. So giving them a horse is a little bit like carrying coals to Newcastle because they are already, the master of horses. Why would you give them a horse? That's a bit weird. But you could say, okay, well, they bow to their mastery of horse rearing, so they give them a horse. Because, if you're a crazy cat lady, you enjoy getting more cats or cat-like stuff. Some say it's actually a metaphor for an earthquake. And you kind of go, why? Well, because what happens is the Greeks leave, but the elite warriors are in this huge horse. So the Trojans bring the horse inside the city walls, and then they celebrate and get completely plastered and fall asleep. The Greeks get out, slaughter everybody, open the gates to the now returned Greek army, because they only took their ship so far and then returned in the dead of night, and basically all of Troy is destroyed. And some say that it's a metaphor for an earthquake, because we have Poseidon, who's the god of horses and the god of earthquakes, but also the god of the sea. And we know that there is an earthquake in this area, and we see in the archaeological finds that Troy, one of the Troys was destroyed in an earthquake. So maybe this was one metaphor for it. I'm not so sure if this convinces me, but it's another explanation of why a horse. And then the whole thing with the horse brings us back to another cycle, and that is the Cassandra story, because Cassandra is the daughter of Priam, sister to Hector and Paris. And there's again conflicting myths around her. Number one, she is a seer. She can see the future. And Apollo falls in love with her, tries to rape her. She says no. And he curses her and says, no one will ever believe your predictions. You will be telling the truth, but nobody, you are cursed with being not believed. And then the other myth goes that she basically says to Apollo, I'll sleep with you if you give me the gift of foresight. And he says, sure, gives her the gift of foresight, and then she denies him. And then he curses her. Either way, we have Cassandra who sees the future. She knows what's going to happen. She knows what's in the horse. She knows that Troy will be destroyed. She sees her brother Hector being killed. Well, Hector is killed. She sees Hecuba and everyone else being killed. She sees Astyanax, Hector's and Andromache's son, being killed. He's a babe in arms. He's basically smashed against the wall of Troy. It's a terrible scene, actually. And she sees all of this. And she also sees that the Greeks will invade the city. And she actually walks around the horse and talks in Greek to the horse, hoping. And she's trying to imitate the voices of the loved ones of these people in that horse, trying to elicit some form of answer to prove that there are soldiers in there. But nothing happens, and since she is cursed with being able to foresee the future, but also nobody believing her, nothing happens. The Greeks invade the city, destroy the city. She gets raped by Ajax at the altar of, holding on to the statue of Athena in Athena's temple. She is then taken by Agamemnon as his concubine to Mycenae, and she also foresees everything that's going to happen then and following on from this, because of course Clytemnestra is super pissed at her husband because he killed their daughter Iphigenia, as we know. Also, he's been gone for 10 years, and she has a lover, Aegisthus. And they think, oh, it would be good to be king instead of the king, and also he killed my daughter, so let's just, kill him when he's back. And Cassandra knows this. She knows that Aegisthus and Clytemnestra will kill Agamemnon and will kill her. And of course that comes to pass. They arrive in Mycenae. Clytemnestra pretends to be the loving wife, so happy to see her husband back. He goes into the bath. She murders him, and then she murders Cassandra. This whole story this part is seen in the Oresteia. As a result, of course, Orestes is in a double bind, because by divine law, he needs to avenge his father's killer. However, his father's killer is also his mother, and you're not allowed to kill your parents. So he decides to kill his father's killers, Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, to avenge his father, but at the same time commit matricide, which means that the Furies then start to haunt him. And they hound him down, they cause paranoia, so madness and persecution. And then this whole thing is then decided at the end by Athena, Deus Ex Machina, it's the Oresteia. Maybe I will talk about this one as well. But this is how this story ends. And of course then we have the other big follow-on that is the sequel, the Odyssey, where Odysseus spends 10 years at sea because Ajax raped Cassandra and enraged Athena, and she destroyed large parts of the Greek army on their way home. So they may have sacked Troy and destroyed, but most of them die on their way home, if they didn't die before Troy. So they don't really have much luck with all of this. And Odysseus gets lost at sea, and he travels for 10 years, and he encounters all kinds of monsters, blah, blah, blah. So if you like, if people say fantasy isn't for grown-ups, the Odyssey and the Iliad are fantasy novels, if you like, or fantasy stories, and they were so for grown-ups. They were recited in Athens, even in classical times, to a grown-up audience. So this is fantasy. Anyway, so we've got Odysseus and his problems, and then of course whatever happens to Helen. Helen and Menelaus get back together and live happily ever after in Sparta, and even in classical times there was something called their mausoleum. So classical Greeks thought that the two of them were buried in Sparta. So that's the end basically, or the aftermath. So some protagonists die there and then in Troy or before Troy. Some die on their way home. Some die in family tragedies or, killing sprees like Agamemnon. And Menelaus and Helen, the ship that launched, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the reason for this war, she lives to ripe old age in Sparta. And that's essentially the story of the Iliad. And in my opinion, the greatest piece of literature ever written. And I can highly recommend it if you don't want to read there is basically the Latimore translation, which is written in verse. You can't see this, but there's also a couple of prose translations. Having said this, the English translation that I have read is also a verse translation, but it's really readable. So you shouldn't be afraid to read it in verse, and it is well worth it. It is well worth it. So that's all from me, and now I'm going to finish my hot chocolate and talk to you soon. Bye.